Violence against African Americans has been occurring since the Africans were captured and placed into holding cells and slave ships. They were shackled, branded, and beaten into submission if they resisted. On the brutal ride to the Americas, many women were raped and taken advantage of, a practice that also carried on to plantations. Africans experienced violence towards them from the period where they were captured and throughout their time as a slave. The process is to strip away their culture and sense of being a human. They were treated like animals from the start of this chattel slavery. Once the slaves arrived, they faced violence in the form of seasoning, breaking individuals to condition them to become a slave. They were beaten and oftentimes branded. Beatings weren't uncommon. While on the plantation, slaves were subjected to whippings. Many slaves were unable to escape this form of punishment at least once in their lifetime. Fear was believed to be a great motivator to make slaves work harder and to suppress those who wanted to rebel. Over the 80 years following the end of the Civil War, African Americans, especially in the South, experienced a horrific amount of violence and what some may call domestic terrorism. In many cases, blacks were victim to a system that was essentially slavery. To perpetuate fear in the black community and to enforce the idea of white supremacy, violence was the answer for many against African Americans. Lynching was a common tactic used, primarily done in the South. In most cases, it was comprised of large mobs, sometimes up to thousands. Lynching was not a common act of violence against slaves before the Civil War. It was only until the 1870s and on when blacks had gained their quote-unquote freedom in essential ways, and were then seen as a bigger threat to white supremacy did the numbers rise. Victims were beaten, shot, mutilated, and sometimes whipped before being hung and burned. Lynchings, not only physical, affected blacks emotionally. A realization that at any moment they could be taken from their homes by mobs and tortured and murdered kept them in constant fear and repression. Crime and punishment were used against blacks to promote an agenda based on hate and racism. The system, meant to protect all citizens of America, had failed greatly for African Americans.
The late 50s and 60s were marked by a period of social and political change for African Americans. Change that would come to fruition in the wake of years of violence, struggle, and undying determination. With the Supreme Court's decision to integrate schools following the 1954 case of Brown v. Board of Education, racial tensions skyrocketed in the United States, a distinguished line between whites and blacks. While the resistance to integration was powerful, the opposing advocacy was equally as strong. Organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and training schools like the Highlander Folk School saw the congregation of both whites and blacks who worked side by side for social reform. Other forms of nonviolent protests such as sit-ins, marches, and freedom rides began to grow rapidly in number. While equality advocates grew in number and fervor, the forces against change became more involved as well. Church burnings and bombings increased. Violence against peaceful protesters was carried out by law enforcement in the forms of tear gas, dogs, and fire hoses, leaving demonstrators severely injured. In spite of these opposing forces, in 1964 the Civil Rights Act was signed into law. Segregation was now illegal. But the battle wasn't over yet. The road to equality is a perilous one, and the fight still continues to this day.
More black men are incarcerated now than were enslaved in 1850. The figures are stunning. They are sobering, eye-opening numbers. While black men account for roughly 6.5% of the U.S. population, they make up 40.2% of the prison population.
These assholes, they always get away.
Are you following him?
Yeah.
Okay, we don't need you to do that.
This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something.
I remember when they began to unload the body, and I realized that that box had my baby's body in it.
The worst phone call any mother could receive to tell you that your 17-year-old son had been shot and killed